Under the heavy clouds that pressed low over the northern sea, the Viking longship moved like a wounded animal, slow, creaking, and alive in its own painful rhythm. The men aboard were silent except for the labored breathing that came between the crash of the waves. The wind carried the smell of salt and tar, mixed with the dense musk of wool, wet leather, and unwashed bodies. It was the kind of smell that settled deep in the skin and never left. For days they had seen no sun, no stars, only the endless gray horizon where sea and sky met like a dull blade. And yet they rode. They rode because stopping meant freezing, and freezing meant dying. The sea did not need to rage to kill a man. It could simply wait, patient as death itself. The leader of the ship, Eric, son of Thord, sat near the stern, his eyes half open, half dreaming. His beard was stiff with salt, his hands cracked and raw from the oar. He had led raids before, had tasted battle and glory, but none of that mattered here. Out here, the enemy was not a man with a sword. It was the cold, a living spirit that crept into the bones and whispered that it would be easier to just stop rowing, to just lie down and sleep. He looked at his men, young boys from the fjords, fathers with scars, a few who had once been kings in their own small valleys. Now all were the same. Hunger and cold had stripped away pride, name, and past. They were simply men trying to see another dawn. The longship groaned as a wave broke across the bow, spraying them with icy water. It soaked their woolen tunics and seeped into their boots. A few cursed under their breath, but most said nothing. They had learned that words were warmth wasted. At night, when the oars were stowed and the sail lowered, they crawled under their cloaks and into the hud fat. The sheepskin sacks they shared in pairs. It was a strange kind of closeness, one that made men forget shame. Survival had its own rules, and comfort was no longer something noble. It was simply what kept breath in the chest. Eric shared his hud fat with a young man named Torin, barely 20, whose hands still shook when he gripped his oar. Torin had joined this voyage to prove himself, to earn silver and stories. But now he whispered to himself at night, words from old sagas his mother had told him. Eric could feel his trembling through the furs. Sometimes he would speak softly to calm him, not as a commander, but as one frozen soul speaking to another. "The cold cannot kill what burns inside," he said once. And though the words sounded foolish even to him, Torin stopped shaking. It was the kind of lie a leader must tell to keep men alive. They had left Norway 2 weeks before, chasing the promise of new land and trade beyond the horizon. The sea had turned against them on the third day. Storms came like beasts, roaring and biting. And when the wind finally died, the cold settled in. It was not the cold of winterland. This was a deeper, endless kind, born from the breath of the sea itself. It got into the teeth, froze the sweat on their brows, made their joints ache like broken hinges. Even the ship seemed to shiver, its timbers flexing and groaning as if it too longed for fire. At dawn, when the light barely touched the waves, Eric ordered them to eat. They had no flame, only salted fish and hard bread. The bread was like stone, the fish stiff with salt, but it was fuel. They chewed without speaking. One of the older men, Halvar, cracked a joke about missing his wife's soup, and a few men managed weak laughs. It was not because it was funny, but because laughter reminded them that they were still human. The sails hung heavy with frost and every breath became mist. A few tried to stamp their feet for warmth, but there was nowhere to move. The deck was their world, wet, narrow, and cold. When Eric looked at them, he saw not warriors, but furnaces of flesh, each fighting to keep its own fire burning. That was the real war, the war no saga would ever sing. As night came again, the sea calmed, but the cold deepened. The sky turned black and full of slow, crawling clouds. Torin crawled into the hud fat beside Eric, pressing close, his breath shallow. Around them, others did the same. It was strange how silence could feel loud. The sound of men breathing together, the shifting of furs, the creak of wood. The air inside the hud fat was thick and sour, but it was warm. Warmth was holiness here, and sweat was prayer. In that darkness, Torin whispered, "Do you think the gods see us now?" Eric thought for a long time before answering. "If they do, they are watching what they made. Men who won't give up." Torin said nothing, but Eric felt him nod. The next morning, a pale sun broke through the clouds, lighting the sea like a blade of silver. The men lifted their heads, blinking as if seeing light for the first time. Someone shouted that the gods had returned, and for a brief moment, hope rippled across the ship like a spark. They hoisted the sail and moved with the wind, the cold biting less cruelly now. Even the gulls appeared circling overhead, a sign of land perhaps, but the sea was never kind for long. By midday, the wind shifted, turning against them. The sails snapped like a whip, and waves rose again, towering and merciless. Eric roared orders, his voice barely cutting through the storm. The men pulled the oars, muscles screaming, faces pale with effort. Water flooded the deck, and they bailed with their helmets, desperate to keep afloat. In the chaos, Torren slipped, striking his leg against the chest that served as his seat. Blood mixed with seawater, bright red against gray foam. Eirik dragged him back up, shouting over the storm, "Stay awake. Don't you dare sleep now." Torren's face was pale, his teeth chattering. Eirik tore a strip from his own cloak, bound the wound, and pressed Torren's hands to his own chest to share warmth. It was madness, but it was the only way. When the storm finally broke, half the men were too weak to row. They drifted under a sky bruised with purple clouds, the sea hissing quietly around them. Eirik knew they were near the edge, not of the map, but of endurance. His hands bled from blisters, his throat burned from salt, but his eyes still searched the horizon. He had promised them land, and he would not die without seeing it. That night, they gathered what remained of their strength. They ate cold fish and chewed strips of fat like leather. No one spoke. Even the storyteller, who used to recite old verses to keep their minds alive, had gone silent. Eirik looked at them and understood something he had never seen in battle. That courage was not only the swing of a sword or the roar of rage. Courage was this: to sit in the cold, in pain, surrounded by darkness, and still breathe. As they lay in their hudfats, Torren whispered again, "If we die, will the sea remember us?" "The sea remembers everything," Eirik said. "But so will the men who live." Then he closed his eyes and listened to the waves, each one carrying the heartbeat of those who refused to yield. The night stretched long, but somewhere beyond it, the first outline of land waited beneath the clouds, unseen but there. And though their fires had long gone out, something in their hearts still burned, quiet and stubborn, against the endless cold, under a sky that looked tired of its own gray weight. The longship drifted toward a broken line on the horizon that might have been cloud or might have been land, and every man watched it with the quiet fear a child feels before a closed door. Because land could mean rescue, but it could also mean rock and ruin. And in that silence, the waves made a slow, shushing sound as if the sea itself wished to calm them. And Eric, son of Thord, stood with his hands wrapped in old wool and tear, his fingers numb, his mind counting the breaths of his men the way a shepherd counts sheep at dusk. The wind eased, then turned shy, and the sail only trembled. So they took up the oars again and rowed like men pushing against a dark wall, the hull answering with a soft groan each time the blades bit the water. And when the shape ahead finally held its line and lifted with a small pale band beneath it, the men did not cheer, they only breathed out together. Because hope was a thing that burned fuel, and they had learned to spend their fuel like silver, with care. Torren sat near Eirik, his leg bound in a strip of cloak, his face pale but his eyes steady. And when he met Eric's look, he tried a thin smile that meant, "I am still here." And Eirik gave the same smile back because, in a place where no fire could live, the first task of a leader was to keep small fires alive inside. Faces, as the coast grew teeth in detail and the gulls began to talk in small, greedy cries. The water changed color to a green that felt close to grass, and the ship moved over long back muscles of swell that rolled toward a narrow bay tucked between low, dark shoulders of rock. They smelled earth, that old, honest smell of rot and root, and the soft, secret breath of moss. And it struck them so hard that one of the older men, Halvar, pressed his face into his sleeve and laughed without sound because he had not known until then how much a nose could starve. The beach was shingles and kelp lashings. A little stream cut a bright path through it like the scratch of a silver knife. And there were dwarf birches clinging to the slope and a scatter of driftwood that looked like the ribs of old dead ships. And Eirik felt the ship settle as the keel kissed the stones and stopped. And for a breath nothing moved. Then the men moved all at once, slow, stiff, careful as old men because land after long days at sea can rise too fast and throw a man down. They pulled the ship higher by its ropes, set stones under the keel to lift it from the teeth of the tide. And when the last heave was done, some fell to their knees and pressed their hands to the ground, as if touching a warm chest. Though the ground was cold, and Torren, who had been a boy when they left home, looked older by years as he limped onto the beach and washed his hands in the small stream and cried without shame because the water was not a wave and it did not try to take him. There was work even in mercy, and Eirik gave it in a voice that did not need to be loud, for men listen when the body remembers death is near. Two set to bailing the bilge to dry the ship. 2 went to gather driftwood and test it for pitch and rot. 2 took out the sail and stretched it on stones to steam under a weak sun, and then brushed it with fat to seal the threads. And a few dug a shallow pit above the shiny line of tide and lined it with flat stones to make a safe place for a small fire. And when the spark took and the smoke rose in a thin blue thought, the men watched it as if it were a newborn child. Because flame after a voyage without flame is a vision, and they fed it with care. And they boiled water because warm water in a cup is a simple kind of forgiveness. They did not feast, for food must be a plan, not a wish. But they cut the salted fish into thin strips and warmed them and shaved tallow into the pot, so the belly would learn again to ease and not fight. And they held their hands above the steam, and felt feeling come back like a tide that brings small shells, and some curse it soft because warmth can hurt when it returns. And Eric walked among them and touched shoulders, not as a king, but as a man keeping count. And when he came to Torin, he knelt and loosened the old bandage and cleaned the leg with warm water, and he did it slow and steady so the others would see the rhythm and copy it. For survival is often a set of good habits repeated in quiet. When darkness came, it came sudden, as if a large hand closed the sky, and they raised the sail on poles like a tent wall, and set their sea chests as a low windbreak and spread the hudfats near the lee of the ship where the breeze had a smaller bite. Still they paired as they had on the deck, because ashore is not a promise, and a night on land with a thin wind can steal heat as fast as any wave. And 2 bodies in a bag are a small house, and no one questioned this now. Torin slept against Eric, his breathing slow, and Eric did not sleep, for the mind of a leader has ears that keep watch when the eyes close. And he listened to the talking of the stream, and the small feet of night birds, and the distant push and pull of the tide, and he let his thoughts go home for a moment, and then bring themselves back, because the mind too must be led. Near midnight, Halvar began to tell a story in a low voice, not of gods and dragons, but of a winter in his youth when the herd was thin and the roof leaked and his mother boiled nettles with barley and made everyone laugh around a cold hearth so that the air felt warmer. And he said that warmth begins in the face and then finds the hands, and a few smiled under their furs and sleep came easier, and the fire by the stones kept its promise. The morning found them with frost on the sail like a coat of small stars, and the bay was a calm bowl with a skin of pale light. And Eric took 3 men and climbed the low ridge to read the land. Beyond the bay, the coast lifted into a long back of country with little teeth of rock and hollows where a few birches crouched together to talk about wind. And there were no smoke trails and no boat marks and no game paths. But there were signs that the sea liked to throw storms at this shore, for the drift line was high and full of old ropes and the bones of fish. They found a tangle of stormwood farther inland, harder and drier, good for a steady cook fire and for pegs and repairs. And they carried what they could and marked the place with a fork of birch so they could find it again. And when they returned to the beach, the men had already shaped 2 new oar blades from old planks using bone needles as awls and a small iron knife as if it were a king's tool. And that sight made Eric's chest warm because skill is the sweetest heat a crew can carry. They set a day for the ship and a day for the men, because a voyage after a near loss must not begin again on a panic. The ship first. They turned the hull to expose the tired seams. They teased out the old hair and pressed fresh tow and wool and smeared it with pine tar, warmed in a pot so it settled like thick honey and then cooled to a black skin. And they checked the steering board pin and found it sound. And they retwisted 2 lengths of rigging rope that had lost their bite. And they stitched the sail where it had taken a small tear, and each repair was a prayer written in work. Then the men. They rubbed feet with fat and dried them by the fire and let the skin breathe and then wrapped them in dry wool. And they warmed water with a pinch of salt and a scrap of dried herb Halvar carried in a linen twist. And each man drank a cup slow to remind his belly that peace was possible. And they cleaned what they could clean, not chasing village neatness but cutting away the worst so sickness would find fewer doors. And they sat in the weak sun with their cloaks off to let the damp flee, and the sight of steam rising from wool became a small joy. That evening Eric spoke. Not long, because long words in cold air die before they reach the ear. He said that the sea has 2 honest faces, gift and test, and that this bay had been both. And he said that they would leave at dawn, because the wind would turn, and the sky had a pale line that meant a fair push for a day and a half. And he said that their fire was not in the pit, but in their keeping of one another. And that the hudfat made sense because a ship is a single animal made of many warm parts. And if one part goes cold, the animal stumbles. And he looked at each man and made sure the eyes looked back, because a scent is also heat. Torin asked in a small voice if fear ever ends, and Eric said no. Fear is a tool the body uses to keep life, but it can be held like a rope, not ridden like a wild horse. And Torin nodded as if someone had handed him a better glove. They pushed off at a dawn that wore a necklace of thin clouds and moved out of the bay with the tide under them like a quiet friend. And for a time the sea was almost gentle, and the oars rose and fell with a rhythm that felt like honest work rather than a fight. And they ate while rowing, small mouthfuls, because the day was a gift and gifts must be turned into miles. The cold did not leave. It never leaves at sea, but it became a teacher rather than a thief. And the men arranged their cloaks to trap tiny pockets of their own breath, and they traded oar places to keep every furnace stoked, and they watched each other with the skill of mothers. And when a cloud bank came, they were ready. They lowered sail before it slapped, and when a chop tried to board them, they cut the crest with the bow and let the rest pass. And Eric felt the ship answer like a horse that had remembered its rider. By late day, the wind fell in love with them and filled the square of wool just so, no more, no less, and the ship sliced the gray with a low hiss, and the men told slow stories and mended small things and counted the gulls and made quiet plans for the next shore. And in that piece, Eric took out a little stone from his pouch, a clear piece of calcite he had kept since a trader showed him a trick, and he held it to the dim light and turned it until the pale sun revealed itself through cloud. And a soft murmur went along the benches because a thing that reads light in gray weather feels like kindness. And Torin held the stone too and learned its mood and laughed a little boy's laugh that surprised even him. They named the stone a friend and put it away as one wraps bread. Night found them again, as it always will, but the cold felt known rather than new, and the men slid into the hudfats in pairs with the ease of a drill, mastered not by pride but by use. And there was no shame in it, only the plain math of life. 2 bodies, 1 bag more, heat less loss, and they slept and woke and changed watches and moved as if they were part of a larger animal that breathed and turned and drank the wind. Toward midnight, Torin woke and listened to the water and said softly that he understood now why the old stories speak of brotherhood like iron links. Because iron is only strong when each link holds the next. And Eric, only half awake, said yes, and then after a pause, said that one day Torin would lead and would learn the weight of keeping faces lit in bad weather. And Torin did not answer because sleep had already taken him. When dawn lifted the lid of the sea again, the horizon opened in a clean line and there was a new coast far off like a darker thought. And Eric felt the map in his head say, "We are better now." And he gave thanks in no special words because gratitude is a warmth that does not need a shrine. He looked down the length of his ship, at raw hands and cracked lips and eyes that still found light. And he knew that their victory so far was not over waves or miles, but over the quiet wish to lie down and go empty. And he knew that if they kept the habits of heat, the small wise acts, the sharing without shame, they could cross not only this gray reach, but other reaches he could not yet name. And he smiled because in a world of cold, a good plan is a good fire. That day they did not speak of gods or omens. They spoke of food and rope and feet and sails, because the sacred lives best in the useful, and they rode when the wind slept, and they let the wind work when it woke, and they drank water in sips not gulps, and they kept a dry cloth for the hands that steered, and they breathed in count with the stroke. And in all this small rightful labor the ship seemed to grow a heart under their feet. And by the time the next night came down gentle, and the stars showed at last like nails in a black board, the cold felt almost like a partner, sharp but honest, and the men laughed a little at nothing and then slept. And Eric lay awake one last time and said to the dark that if leadership is a kind of heat, then he would be heat as long as his breath held. And then he slept too, and the sea, which has no mercy but also no malice, carried them forward, patient as time. The third dawn came with a light that seemed almost kind, though kindness at sea is always a trick of the sky, and the men of Eric's ship had already learned not to trust beauty, for a calm sea can turn cruel faster than a sword can leave its sheath. Yet there was something softer in the wind that morning, a promise that did not shout, only whispered. The horizon glowed faintly pink, and the air tasted of salt and pine sap drifting from a far coast they could not yet see. The oars moved through the water with rhythm now, not as the desperate push of survivors, but as the steady heartbeat of men who had remembered how to live. They were still thin, still tired, but the hollow look that once haunted their eyes had been replaced by something heavier and steadier. Resolve. The kind that grows only after a man has seen death up close and chosen not to bow. Eric stood at the prow, his cloak stiff with frost, his beard streaked white with salt. He could feel the ship breathing beneath his boots, the creak of timbers and the soft sigh of pitch seams swelling against the tide. Each sound was a reminder that the ship too was alive, a companion born of oak and sweat, bound together by men who trusted it more than they trusted the gods. Torin was at the second oar, his wounded leg stiff but usable, his movements careful and slow. He had changed since the storm. Where there had once been fear, now there was something quieter, like respect, for the sea, for the cold, for life itself. Halvar hummed a tune under his breath, the kind sung by farmers when cutting hay, and others joined him one by one, until the low chant carried over the water like a soft drum. It was not a song of triumph, it was a song of endurance. By midday, the sky turned thick and low again, and the horizon blurred into a long smear of silver. That was when they saw it. A second ship, smaller, riding awkwardly in the swell to the west. Its mast was crooked, its sail half torn, and the black bird painted on its prow flapped like a broken wing. Eirik's heart tightened. Another crew adrift. He signaled his men to slow the oars. They drew near until they could see faces, pale, desperate, eyes sunken deep into skulls. Only 6 men were visible on the deck, though a longship of that size should have carried 20 at least. One raised an arm, weak and trembling. It was not a threat, it was a plea. Torin whispered, "They're dying." And Eirik knew he was right. From here he could see their hunger, the sickness in the way they moved, the thin smoke of rot and old blood that no wind could hide. Yet helping them was danger. They had little food left, barely enough for their own journey. And disease was a cruel stowaway. One sick man could bring death to them all. For a moment the old instinct rose, to pass by, to survive. But as he looked at them, the thought curdled. He remembered the night of the storm, the cold hand he had held to keep alive. He thought of Torin, of all the pairs who had shared their breath in the Hudfats. If warmth was sacred, it could not be hoarded. He ordered them closer. Some of his crew murmured, uneasy, but no one disobeyed. The gap between ships narrowed, ropes were thrown and caught with shaking hands. When the 2 hulls kissed with a dull thud, Eirik crossed first, his boots landing on the enemy's deck that smelled of sickness and fear. The men there stared at him like ghosts afraid of their own reflection. One, barely more than a boy, tried to speak but only coughed, his breath thin and wet. Eirik knelt beside him offering water. The boy drank greedily, then whispered, "Iceland." "We were bound for Iceland." His voice broke into a whisper of sobs. Eirik looked around, barrels empty, flesh stripped from bone, eyes wide with hunger. He saw the truth. They had been lost for weeks, drifting, their provisions gone. Some had died. The rest had eaten what they could find. The sea hides many sins, but hunger is the worst of them. Eirik returned to his ship, his jaw tight. Halvar met his eyes and asked the question none dared speak aloud. "What do we do with them?" The leader's answer came after a long silence. "We feed them," he said simply. "If the sea teaches us anything, it's that warmth shared is life extended. We take them aboard, those who can still stand." There was a pause, then a murmur of agreement, and soon ropes creaked again. Bodies were lifted. Water and bits of salted fish passed from one hand to another. The rescued men wept as they ate, their faces hollow, but their eyes alive again. Torin helped one older man whose hands trembled too much to lift the food, and as he held the morsel to his lips, he felt something strange, an echo of the warmth he had once borrowed from Eirik in the cold. Survival, he realized, was not a solitary fire. It was a chain of flames passed hand to hand. That night, they anchored between 2 rising cliffs where the wind was less cruel. The 2 crews, once strangers, now huddled together on one deck. There was no room for pride here. They shared the Hudfats, the few that remained dry and lay pressed close like one body stitched together by need. Eirik stayed awake most of the night, watching the horizon for storms and the faces for fever. He knew he had risked everything by bringing them aboard. Yet when he looked at Torin and the others sleeping side by side with the strangers, he felt no fear, only a heavy, tired peace. The sea could take their ship, their strength, even their names, but it could not take this small defiance, this act of warmth against the endless cold. In the morning, one of the new men died quietly before dawn. They wrapped him in a piece of sail and let him slip into the water. The sea took him without a sound. It was a hard thing, but Eirik made no speech. The living did not need words. They needed will. By midday, the wind had turned in their favor again, and they raised the sail, the patched wool swelling like a great lung. With the help of the new men, the ship felt stronger, fuller, as if the dead vessel had given its breath to theirs. When Torin took the oar, he felt the rhythm pulse through the planks, a strange unity, dozens of hearts beating in one wooden chest. Days passed. They saw no more land, but their spirits no longer hung on that alone. They had found something steadier, something carried in the small acts of care that threaded through their days. A hand steadying an oar, a shoulder offered during the watch, a shared piece of dried meat given without request. Once near sunset, Halvor began a story about an old fisherman who survived a winter by singing to his own shadow. And the men laughed, not because the story was funny, but because it was human, and laughter itself was a rebellion against the cold. When the night came, the Hudfats were crowded now, the ship packed with twice the heat it once held. The smell was foul, but the warmth was divine. Torin, awake under the firs, whispered to Eric, "We could have left them. We might have reached home sooner." Eric's eyes stayed on the stars, small holes in the dark. "Maybe," he said. "But what home would we reach if we became colder than the sea?" Torin thought about that for a long time, then closed his eyes, the slow rocking of the ship like a heartbeat beneath them. When dawn came again, the sea was glass, and the sun burned pale and cold over the rim of the world. Their breath rose in white clouds as they rowed, but something had changed. They were not just men fleeing death now. They were keepers of a small light, a warmth that no storm could drown. They had learned that survival was not in the strength of arms or the sharpness of blades, but in the quiet, stubborn act of sharing what little fire one carried inside. The ship cut through the still water like a slow-moving torch, its men alive in a way that few ever were. And though the world around them was endless gray, there was a glow on their faces that came not from the sun, but from within. The fourth morning came heavy with mist, the kind that hides the sea's edges and makes the sky and water one endless gray bowl. The air was still, thick and cold enough to bite the inside of the nose when breathed too deep. The longship moved slow through the haze, its oars dipping softly, barely making sound. Every man strained his eyes for shape or shadow, for any sign that the endless drifting had meaning. Then, just after noon, the mist thinned like torn cloth, and before them rose a dark outline. Land, real land this time, not cloud or trick of light. It came sudden and silent, cliffs black and sharp as the bones of the world, their tops crowned with low scrub and pale grass. The sea struck against their base in slow folds of foam. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Halvor whispered, "The gods still remember us." And a slow murmur of thanks rippled through the crew, quiet and honest, like the hum of a low fire. Eirik stood at the bow, his eyes narrow, reading the coast as a hunter reads tracks. The place was wild, untouched, and carried the feeling of waiting, as if no foot had ever pressed its soil, as if it was holding its breath to see if these strangers were worth welcoming. He lifted a hand and pointed to a narrow gap between the cliffs where the sea ran calmer, a cut that promised a cove or beach beyond. "There," he said, and his voice was hoarse but sure. The men angled the oars, and the ship obeyed, sliding toward that small gate in the stone wall. The water changed as they entered, dark giving way to green, and the sound of waves softened. Inside the cliffs lay a hidden bay, round and deep, its sand pale and scattered with driftwood. Gulls rose screaming from the rocks, circling them with cries that sounded half like warning and half like song. When the keel scraped sand, the men almost didn't believe it. They sat still for a heartbeat, listening to the new sound, the steady whisper of shore water licking stone. Then, one by one, they climbed out, their boots sinking into cold, wet sand. For a long moment, they simply stood, staring at the land, breathing air that did not taste of salt. Torin bent and touched the ground, his fingers trembling. "It's real," he said softly, and Eric smiled the smallest smile he had in weeks. They pulled the ship higher, wedging stones under her belly to keep her safe from the tide. The wood creaked like an old creature finally allowed to rest. Then the work began. They searched the edge of the bay, following a stream that ran down from the hills. The water was clear and cold, fresh as morning rain. They drank deep, then filled the barrels, laughter returning for the first time since memory could measure. One of the rescued men, a wiry fellow named Asgeir, found berries clinging to low bushes. He ate two, waited, then smiled. "Sweet," he said, and the others joined him. Soon hands were stained red with juice, and their tongues felt alive again. They gathered driftwood for a fire, but this time they built it slow and careful, not as desperate men begging flame for life, but as craftsmen making an offering. When the fire caught, it was steady and warm, and its smoke curled into the sky in a single straight line. As night came, they made a camp on the sand. The sea was a black mirror, and the cliffs stood like guards around them. Torin and Eric sat near the fire, watching the sparks drift up like tiny souls. "We found land," Torin said, his voice full of something like wonder. "Maybe this is the new world." Eric shook his head. "No world is new," he said slowly. "It's only new to the ones who survive to see it." Torin frowned, thinking, then nodded. "Still," he said, "it feels like the gods gave us another chance." Eric looked at the fire and thought of all the faces they had left behind, and of the sea that never returned what it took. "The gods give nothing," he said finally. "They only let us keep what we can hold." The next morning, they began to explore beyond the cove. The land was quiet, filled with the sound of wind moving through grass and the cry of distant birds. They found no sign of men, but they found footprints of deer and once the faint marks of something larger, maybe bear, maybe boar. Halvar grinned and said it was good land, rich land. But Eric's eyes stayed cautious. The cliffs offered shelter, but they also felt like walls, and the air carried an unease he could not name. Still, the men worked. They built lean shelters of driftwood and stretched the sail as a roof. They dug pits for fire, gathered moss to dry their boots, and for the first time in many weeks, they ate meat. Fish caught in the shallow stream, roasted over the flame. The taste was life itself, but comfort has its price. By the third day, the mist returned, thick and heavy. It crept over the cliffs, rolled into the bay, and wrapped around the camp like cold smoke. They could barely see one another through it. The fire hissed and dimmed, and the sound of the sea seemed closer, whispering strange echoes. Torin woke in the night to the feeling of cold breath on his face. When he looked, no one was there. He pulled his cloak tighter and whispered a prayer, the kind his mother had taught him, for warmth and protection. The next morning, one of the rescued men, the quiet one they called Bjorn, was missing. They found his footprints in the sand leading toward the cliffs, but beyond that, nothing. The sea had taken him, or something else had. Eric gathered the men, his face unreadable. "No one goes alone," he said. "And we do not stay long. This place gives us water, not a home." Some muttered that leaving now was folly, that the land was safe and generous, but Eric's word held. "Too much comfort," he said, "and a man forgets the cost of warmth." "We move when the tide turns." They launched again at dusk, the mist still thick. Torin looked back at the small fire dying on the shore. It looked like an eye closing. "We could have stayed," he said quietly. Eirik, standing at the stern, said, "The sea moves, so must we." And so they did. The first night back on water was silent, but strange. The sea was calm, yet the men felt a weight in their chests. The warmth they had known on land seemed already fading like a dream slipping away. Halvar tried to lift their spirits with a story, but his voice was tired and no one laughed. They rowed slow, each man lost in his thoughts. Torin looked at the stars and wondered if the sea had a memory, if it remembered every ship, every scream, every whisper of hope. Perhaps it did. Then near dawn the mist lifted again, and what it revealed was not sky, not open sea, but another coastline, closer, darker, and lined with forests. Eirik blinked, uncertain. The current had carried them farther than he'd thought. This shore was different, wilder, deeper green, and the trees leaned over the water as if to look at them. Birds moved through the branches in flashes of white and gray. "There," said Torin softly. "Another chance." Eric nodded, though his heart was heavy. Every chance, he thought, comes with its price. They guided the ship toward the trees, the oars whispering through the calm. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. This land did not feel waiting. It felt alive, watching, listening. When they beached the ship, the silence of the forest was so deep that it swallowed the sound of their boots. And yet, for the first time in all their voyage, the cold seemed to ease. The air was warmer, the ground soft beneath their feet. Eirik knelt, pressed his hand to the soil, and felt heat, faint but real, rising from below. "The earth is breathing here," he said, and Torin whispered, "Maybe this is the warmth we were meant to find." But even as the words left his lips, the forest wind shifted, and the warmth turned strange, too still, too heavy. Birds fled the trees, their cries echoing like warnings. The men stood together, a small circle in a vast unknown land, and the old fear returned, not of cold this time, but of what waited beyond sight. Eric looked to the horizon, then to his men. "We'll rest here," he said, though his eyes stayed hard. "But keep your blades near and your hearts steady. Warmth can be a gift, but sometimes it's bait. The men nodded and began to build their camp once more, unaware that the story of their survival was only half written, that the true trial ahead would not come from the sea, but from the land that seemed to breathe beneath their feet. Journey began beneath the tall black pines of the new land, where the earth itself seemed alive with quiet heat and hidden breath. When they first stepped into that forest, the air felt strange, heavy with a kind of warmth that did not belong to the north. The mist clung to the trees like old spirits, and underfoot the ground gave softly, spongy with moss that steamed faintly in the morning light. The men moved slowly, half in awe, half in fear, because after so many weeks of bone-deep cold, warmth felt like a miracle, but also like a trick. They had learned too well that nothing in this world came without cost. Eric walked ahead, his hand on his axe not for battle but for reassurance. The forest was silent except for the far-off sound of dripping water. It was the sound of a place holding its secrets close. They followed a small stream uphill, its path lined with stones that glowed faintly in the dim light. Torin crouched and touched one, then looked up, his voice low. "It's warm," he said, and Eric knelt beside him, feeling it for himself. It was true. The stone carried a faint, steady heat, as if the fire of the earth lived beneath it. Eric straightened and looked around. Steam rose in thin ribbons from between the rocks, carrying the smell of sulfur and wet stone. "The land here breathes," he said quietly, "and it remembers its fire." The men murmured among themselves. Some called it a blessing, others a warning. They built their camp at the edge of a small clearing where the ground was firm and dry. For the first time since they had left home, they did not need a fire to keep warm. The air itself wrapped around them like a cloak, and their breath no longer smoked in the cold. It felt wrong in a way none of them could explain, like standing in a stranger's home, welcomed by a hand they could not see. They rested, ate their salted meat, and let their tired muscles loosen. Even Eric, who had learned to trust nothing but his own instincts, allowed himself a few moments of stillness. That night, they slept without the hudfats, lying under the open sky. It was strange not to feel the press of another body beside them, not to fight for shared heat. Some woke in the night simply because their skin missed the weight of another man's breath. Warmth once rare and sacred now came too easily, and with ease came something new, dreams. Torin dreamed of his home in Norway, of the longhouse glowing gold, with firelight, of his mother's hands spinning wool, of his sister singing by the door. He woke with tears on his face and a pain in his chest that felt sharper than hunger. Beside him, Halvar snored softly, his face peaceful. Eric lay awake, staring at the stars he could barely see through the canopy, his mind heavy with thought. The next morning, they found tracks near the edge of the camp. Not animal, human. Small light prints in the damp moss, too delicate to belong to warriors. Eric studied them in silence. Torin asked, "People?" Eric nodded slowly. "Or something like them." The men grew uneasy. They had believed this land empty, untouched. Now it felt watched. Still, they needed water and food. Eric divided them into pairs to scout the area, warning them not to stray far. Torin went with Halvar, their path leading them deeper into the trees where the air grew hotter and the moss gave off a faint shimmer. After a time, they came to a hollow in the earth, wide and round, filled with steam. At its center was a pool, glowing faintly blue under the mist. Torin knelt at its edge, dipped his hand into the water, and gasped. It was hot, almost too hot to bear. "A spring," Halvar said softly. "The fire of the world, trapped and waiting." They drank from their flasks and washed their faces, the heat easing the ache from their bodies. For a moment it felt like the land itself was healing them. But when Torin looked down into the pool, he saw something that made his heart tighten. Faint shapes beneath the surface, pale and still. Not rocks. Bones. They returned to camp before sunset, silent, carrying the weight of what they'd seen. When Eric asked, Torin told him everything. The water, the heat, the bones. Eric listened, his face dark. "No man drinks from a grave," he said. "We leave tomorrow." But the men, tired of running from the sea, murmured in disagreement. "This place feeds us," Asgeir said. "It warms us." "It could be home." Eric looked at him sharply. Home? The word tasted bitter. Home is built with years, not with chance. Yet even as he spoke, he knew the pull of rest. The forest's warmth was like a hand on his back, steady, persuasive. That night he could not sleep. He walked alone to the edge of the camp and looked out over the valley. Steam rose in quiet tendrils, catching the moonlight, and the air smelled faintly sweet now, like burning pine sap. From far off came a low hum, almost like voices singing beneath the earth. It reminded him of the sound of oars and rhythm, of the heartbeat of his ship. He closed his eyes and listened, and for a moment, he thought he could hear words in it, not in the tongue of men, but older, slower, like the breath of the land itself. When he opened his eyes, the mist had thickened again, and through it, he thought he saw movement, a figure, pale and slender, standing by the trees. He called out, but the shape dissolved into the fog. In the morning, one of the rescued men, the same as Gear who had spoken of staying, was gone. They found no sign of struggle, no tracks this time, only his cloak, folded neatly beside the place where he had slept, and the faint smell of ash in the air. The men grew quiet, eyes darting toward the forest. Eric gathered them. "This land is not ours," he said, voice hard. "We take what we need and we go." There was no argument now. Fear had replaced hope. They worked in silence, packing their supplies, filling the barrels with fresh water from the stream that ran colder than the springs. But as they loaded the ship, Torin noticed something that chilled him more than the sea ever had. The wood of the hull was damp, not from the tide, but from within, as if the ship itself was sweating. He touched it and drew back. It was warm. "She's taken the land's breath," Halvor said softly, almost in awe. "Even the ship wants to stay." That night, before they pushed off, Eric made them all sit by the dying fire. "We leave at dawn," he said, "and we leave nothing behind that can call us back." He took his knife and cut a piece from his cloak, tossed it into the flames. One by one, the others did the same. A lock of hair, a strip of cloth, a token from their time ashore. When it was Torin's turn, he hesitated, then dropped a small stone he had taken from the warm spring. It cracked in the fire with a sound like breaking bone, and for a moment the flames turned green. The men stared, uneasy, until the light faded and the fire went out. They left before sunrise, rowing hard through the mist. Behind them the forest disappeared slowly into gray, the warmth fading with it. The sea was cold again, biting, alive. The men shivered, but it was a familiar cold, an honest one. Torin looked back once and thought he saw shapes moving along the shore, pale against the dark trees, watchers maybe, or ghosts. He turned away. As the wind filled the sail and the ship began to glide north again, Eric stood at the stern, his eyes on the horizon. The warmth of the forest still lingered in his bones, but he did not trust it. Warmth without struggle, he thought, is a lie. It softens men until they forget how to fight. He looked at his crew, tired, scarred, but alive, and felt a strange pride. They had faced cold, hunger, and temptation, and still they rowed. The sea had taken many things, but it had not taken their will. The mist behind them sank back into silence. Somewhere deep in the forest they had left. The earth still breathed, and the bones beneath the springs waited for the next ship, the next men to arrive and mistake comfort for mercy. But Eric and his men had learned their lesson. The true warmth was not in the land or the fire or the earth's breath. It was in the simple, stubborn act of men keeping one another alive in the face of everything that wanted them gone. And so they rode on, back into the cold, carrying with them not fear, not regret, but understanding that the warmth worth keeping is the kind you make with your own hands, and that even the coldest sea cannot steal that from those who refuse to let it die. Long and haunted journey began in silence, the kind of silence that lives deep inside the sea where sound itself seems to drown. After leaving the strange forest behind, the men of Eric's ship rode for days beneath skies that changed from gray to black and back again. The air grew colder each night, sharper, as if the ocean wanted to reclaim the heat they had borrowed from the land. The mist thinned, but the wind did not return, and so the ship drifted across a flat, glassy world where the horizon looked like a blade dividing the living from the lost. The men's faces were drawn, their lips cracked, their eyes hollow with the quiet knowledge that the sea, though calm, was waiting for something. Eric could feel it too. Every instinct in his bones told him that the world was holding its breath, that somewhere beyond sight a storm was building, vast and patient, like a god drawing air before it speaks. For a time, they tried to believe the calm would last. They sang low songs to break the stillness, told small stories, cleaned the oars, checked the ropes. But beneath their voices there was always the faint creak of the hull, a sound that spoke of strain, of age, of the endless pull of the sea. Torin often sat near the bow watching the water, and sometimes he would see things moving beneath the surface, shadows that did not belong to whales or fish. He said nothing. He had learned by now that naming a fear gives it weight. It was better to let it drift, unspoken, like a ghost with no home. Then one night, as the moon rose thin and red behind a veil of cloud, the wind returned. It began as a whisper, then grew into a low moan that shivered through the sail. The men stirred, their hands finding ropes and oars by instinct. The first wave struck without warning, a wall of dark water that slapped the side of the ship and drenched them to the bone. The second wave came before they had finished cursing the first. The sea had awakened. It was not angry. Anger implies reason. It was alive in a way that made reason small. The sky split open with lightning, and for a moment the world became a single white flame, then darkness again. "Hold fast," Eirik roared, his voice lost in the wind. Men scrambled to tie ropes, to hold the mast, to bail the water that poured in faster than they could throw it out. The ship rose and fell, each descent slamming their bodies into the wet wood until bones groaned like timbers. Torin gripped his oar, his knuckles white, and shouted prayers he barely remembered. Above them, the sail tore in two, a sound like a scream. For hours, or maybe it was minutes, for time no longer existed. They fought. They fought not the sea, for no man can fight that, but the simple act of not letting go. One by one, the men disappeared into the dark, snatched by waves or crushed beneath the mast. Halvar was among them. Eirik saw him fall, his hand still gripping a rope, his face calm, almost peaceful as the sea swallowed him whole. There was no time for grief. The storm had become the only thing. When dawn came, it came gray and cruel. The wind had broken, but so had the ship. The mast was gone, the sail a tangle of rags floating like a dead bird. Only 9 men remained of the 30 who had once rowed beneath Eric's command. The rest were part of the sea now, their names carried into the deep. The survivors clung to what was left: planks, ropes, barrels, the warped body of the longship that still, somehow, floated. Eirik sat at the stern, his hair plastered to his face, blood trickling from a cut on his temple. His hands were steady, though his heart was not. Torin crawled to him, his voice hoarse. "We can't row anymore," he said. "The oars are gone." Eirik nodded. "Then we drift," he said simply. "The sea has taken its due. It will decide what is left for us." The words were not faith. They were surrender wrapped in acceptance. For 3 days they drifted, feeding on bits of dried fish and melted rainwater caught in their cloaks. The cold returned with full strength, biting through their soaked clothes, turning breath into frost. At night, they huddled together beneath what remained of the hudfats, sharing warmth like the last secret of mankind. In those dark hours, the difference between one man and another disappeared. They were no longer warriors, no longer explorers, not even Vikings. They were simply men, flesh and breath, heat and hope. The line between life and death blurred until it became a thin thread of will. On the 4th night, Torin woke to find Eirik sitting upright, staring at the horizon. There was a light there, faint, golden, trembling. "Fire," Torin whispered. Eirik did not answer. His eyes were wet, though whether from salt or tears, Torin could not tell. "Land," Eirik said softly, "or the end." The men stirred, following his gaze, and when they saw the light, they began to whisper prayers to gods they no longer trusted but could not forget. They rowed with broken planks, paddling with hands when the planks split. The light grew, then wavered, then grew again. As dawn broke, the light revealed itself for what it was: a small village on the edge of a frozen coast, its fires glowing faintly through the morning mist. The men cheered weakly, the sound closer to weeping than joy. The ship struck sand a short while later, and for a moment no one moved. It was Torin who stepped off first, his legs giving way beneath him as his boots touched earth. The others followed, crawling, staggering, falling to their knees. The villagers, fishermen in rough wool, came running down the beach, their faces full of shock. They helped the men to their feet, wrapped them in blankets, led them toward the fires. As they sat by the flames, the warmth burned like pain at first. It felt wrong to be warm, almost shameful after so much cold. Eirik sat apart from the others, staring into the fire, watching the way it moved, alive and hungry. A child brought him a cup of broth. He took it with shaking hands, drank, and for the first time in what felt like years, he let himself close his eyes. When he opened them again, Torin was sitting beside him. "We made it," the younger man said, his voice thin but steady. Eric nodded. "We did," he said, then looked around at the faces of his crew, what was left of them. They were alive but changed, each man carrying a silence that no song could break. That night, as the wind howled outside the longhouse, Eric lay awake, listening to the fire crackle. He thought of Halvor, of the men lost to the sea, of the warmth that had tested them, and of the storm that had stripped them bare. He realized then that survival was not the same as living. To live was to keep the fire burning, even when the wind howled to put it out. In the morning, he walked to the shore alone. The sea was calm again, stretching to the horizon like nothing had ever happened. He watched the waves roll in, soft and steady, and felt the pull of it, the call that had always lived in his blood. Behind him, the village was waking, the smoke from its hearths rising into the pale sky. Eirik knelt, scooped a handful of cold water, and let it run through his fingers. "You've taken much," he whispered to the sea, "but I've learned what you could not take." Then he stood, his breath visible in the dawn air, and turned back toward the fires where the men were stirring, where life, fragile and warm, waited to begin again. The sea would call him again, he knew, but for now, for this one small moment, he had found the kind of warmth that no storm could touch, the kind that lived in the will of those who refused to let the cold have the final word. And as the morning light grew stronger, it shone across the beach, catching on the wrecked hull of the ship that had carried them through so much. It gleamed for a moment like a memory, like something holy, before the tide took it and carried it slowly, gently, back into the waiting sea. Years passed like slow tides upon the northern shore, and the sea, faithful to its nature, forgot the names of the men it had nearly taken. But the land remembered, and so did Torin, who lived longer than he had ever thought he would. He stayed by that same coast where they had come ashore half dead, long after Eric's beard had turned to snow, and the last of the crew had gone to their rest. He built his house from driftwood and shipwrecked planks, and every piece of wood that touched his hands carried the memory of that voyage. The cries in the storm, the trembling warmth of the hudfat, the slow breath of men who refused to die. People said he had the sea's smell about him, that his eyes still searched horizons even when he sat still, as if he could see the shape of unseen things moving in the mist. In those years, children came to his door with questions. They had heard stories from their fathers, who had heard them from fishermen and traders, stories of the ship that crossed the storm and the men who turned the cold itself into fire. Torin would listen, quiet, and when the fire burned low, he would tell them what truly happened. Not the tales that grew fat with rumor, but the truth that had burned thin and bright in his bones. He would tell them that the sea is not an enemy nor a friend, only a mirror that shows a man what he carries inside, that the cold was not there to destroy them, but to test what they were made of, to strip away every false layer until only the will remained. Sometimes he would walk them to the shore, his steps slow but steady, and point to the horizon where the sun sank like an ember into the gray water. "We thought warmth came from the sun," he would say, "but we were wrong. Warmth is not given. It's made, between men in struggle, in silence, in trust. That's why we survived." And the children, wide-eyed, would listen as the waves rolled in around his words. They didn't understand all of it, not yet, but they understood the sound of his voice, soft, rough, full of something old and true. When Eric died, it was winter, and the sea was frozen in places where even gulls did not fly. Torin buried him by the edge of the cliff where the wind never stopped moving. He carved nothing on the stone. "The sea will speak his name enough," he said. After that, Torin went to the shore every morning, standing barefoot in the snow no matter the weather, whispering to the horizon as if it could hear him. Those who saw him said he looked half made of salt and half made of smoke, a man caught between two worlds. One spring, when Torin's hair had gone white and his hands shook from age, he built a small boat barely more than a cradle, from the last pieces of the ship that had saved them. He worked slowly, every stroke of his knife guided by memory. The wood creaked with old strength, the kind that never really dies. When it was done, he set it upon the water at dawn. The villagers gathered, silent, watching. Torin stood in it, tall despite his frailty, his cloak whipping in the wind. "The sea called me once," he said, voice clear against the hush of morning. "And I answered. It took much, but it gave me the truth of warmth. I go now to see if it remembers." He pushed off, the oar dipping once, twice, the small craft gliding smoothly into the pale mist. They watched until he was only a shadow, then nothing. No one saw him again. But in the weeks that followed, fishermen swore, They saw a faint light far out at sea, a glow like a fire burning beneath the water. Some said it was a trick of the sun. Others said it was the spirit of the man who had carried the warmth of the living into the heart of the cold. Years turned to generations, and the story of Eric, Torin, and the crew became legend. They said their ship was made of men's hearts bound together, that its sails were woven from courage and its hull sealed with faith. Children grew up hearing that even in the blackest storm, if you listen closely, you can hear the beat of their oars beneath the thunder. Not a song of conquest, but of endurance. And when sailors in later ages faced nights so bitter that frost climbed their beards and despair whispered that the dawn would never come, they spoke the old saying that had survived with the tale. The sea takes, the sea tests. But warmth shared never dies, and so it was that the longship of Eric and his men passed into myth, not as a story of plunder or pride, but as the quiet truth of what it means to be human, to burn against the dark, to make fire out of breath, and to find in one another the only warmth the world can never steal. And in the endless rhythm of the waves, that warmth lived on, soft and unseen, carrying their memory through the centuries, the warmth of the living, the courage of the cold, the story of men who learned that even at the edge of the world, the fire inside must never be allowed to die.